Welcome to the Ailm Practice Education Series in partnership with Firm Media, delivering concise and impactful insights for aesthetic and specialty medical practices. Your host, Chris Solhonik.
And today we have a very special guest, Izhak Musli of Clarity Technologies and co-founder of the Aesthetic Success Summit, which is something that you and I have been talking about lately. I know there's a little bit of a buzz about it, and I'm super excited to dive into that a little bit with you. I know it's not going to be the topic of the podcast, but I do want you to say a little bit about it because it's pretty exciting. Today's episode, we're going to discuss key performance indicators and financial insights that will elevate your aesthetic practice performance. Izhak, please tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up in the aesthetic medical space. I've known you for a long time, but our listeners might not.
Yeah, and so I'll tell the short story is I got the chance to develop the first business intelligence dashboard for aesthetic practices. And the longer version of it was actually started a little before. So I was born and raised in Israel as a kid, grew up all my life, pretty much all my teenager into the army. And then after around 2007, I moved to the US, been an entrepreneur all my life and been around technologies as well. When I moved to the US, I joined a startup company and we mainly delivered the point of sale solution for businesses. I was the general manager. I actually started as a 6th employee and grew to be the general manager of that company and helped them to exit. After the acquisition of that company, we started to fly to Texas for quarterly meetings, sitting around people that I was hoping I'm going to learn a lot from, realizing that they don't know their data. I was a Salesforce admin already before that acquisition, and I've been around technology. So for me, data is a way to go and make a decision. And all I'm thinking all the time when I think data is about the future, not about the past of the data, right? The past of data show me what's coming next. And sitting in those quarterly meetings that happening 100 days after the quarter ends, reviewing data that happened but only was prepared 2 weeks before the meeting, kind of like waste of time, right? We're talking about things that happen and never going to happen again.
Sure.
And so if we don't learn out of it and really look how is it going to affect the future, you really don't do justice to the work. And so realizing that, I started to work on a business intelligence dashboard, started to develop, investing my own money in it, and with the purpose of selling it to the same corporate that I'm working in. At that point, I met my wife. My wife's dad is a plastic surgeon, a very well-known plastic surgeon in the US. And we're sitting in a dinner and he's asking me, what is it that I do for a living? And I explained to him what is it that I do and what I'm working on, right? It's a very exciting business intelligence dashboard. And he's like, oh my God, we need it. And at the beginning, I took it with a grain of salt, right? Everybody said that they need it.
Of course.
I interviewed a bunch of other doctors in the industry and realized that nobody knows their data. They're generating millions of dollars a year, flying blind. And so I realized that for me, it's a luxury. For them, it's a real need with a pain. I quit my job, got investors, and launched it into the aesthetic industry. That's really how I got into the industry. We had a very successful run. We sold the company to one of our investors, and almost immediately after that, actually during even the due diligence already, I already realized that there is a greater need, the much low-hanging fruit, analyzing all those hundreds of practices data, realize that most of them, if they can just follow up on the leads that coming through the door, they can make so much more money. And you probably know it.
Music to my ears.
Agency.
Yeah, music to my ears.
Yeah, can't be any closer to you, right?
Yeah.
And so realize that 90% of the leads calling to the practice, unless they schedule the consult at that first phone call, they don't get follow-ups, they don't get nurture campaign, nothing is happening with them. They're never going to hear from the practice again. 100, 200, 500 bucks per lead just drain to the toilet.
Sure.
And so I launched and developed actually myself. That one was a lead management platform, medical PRM. When I was still in beta, starting to run it out, I got in touch with Simplus, THR. They acquired the platform for me when I was still in beta. And so I joined their team and we helped to grow the entire solution for practices together. I was the chief product officer, then chief revenue officer. During this time, and actually way before that, during Atlas KPI, I started to lecture in the industry and really educate about data insights and KPIs and what is KPI stands for, right? Key performance indicators, and really delivering that message and help to educate how to run a business with data. And so during the time, one of my clients was Terry Ross, very well known, one of our biggest practice consultants in our industry. We stayed in touch, we stayed friends, we always seeing each other on the stage. And when I was still with Simplast, one of the conferences that I've seen her, she's like, "Oh my God, you have to see this amazing tool I'm working on." And it was APX platform to the days, right? It was at a very early stage. It was primarily training on demand. And she said, everybody that do the training then wants the data because it always goes hand with hand. And that's really
Sure.
one of the challenges we had with Atlas. We show them the data and then they ask, what do I do about it? That it's normally the training help you to execute on the insights. And we didn't deliver training at the time. I'm still not the practice consultant that's going to tell you how to answer the phone. I'll analyze the data for you.
Sure.
And so we joined power and became co-CEO of Apex Platform. We had, again, very successful run. And about a year and a half ago, we merged with Engage Technology, that now known as Clarity Technologies, that I'm still with as an SVP of Product Management and Data Science. And right before the acquisition, I'll say even a couple of months before that, we started to recognize another need in the industry. We are lecturing in so many conferences, probably close to 20, 25 a year,
Sure.
all aesthetic related industry conferences, and educate about practice management, how to make more money, and the business side of things, right? And so almost in all of them across the board, sometimes you get a workshop of 3 hours, sometimes you get a 1 hour, but the very standard is about 15 minutes talk time. There is not much that I can teach you in 15 minutes. You can be the greatest student, I can be the greatest teacher. I'm not going to be able to change everything, the way that you do business today, and educate about all the variables.
Sure.
And that's really where we launch the aesthetic success. You mentioned, say a couple of words about it. That's the differentiator. It's not that traditional meetings that there is million presenters, everybody getting 15-minute slots, pitching some ideas, theories, and you stay with notes that you don't know how to execute later. It's a hands-on meeting. It's primarily the presenter. It's primarily me and Terry, two talk tracks, 2 rooms. One of them is operational data that I'm leading. Terry is more on the sales and the grow the potential of the revenue side. And it's really hands-on. We have one more partner. He's Dr. Renato Soltz. He's more of a physician, right, a plastic surgeon. Really run the owners to owners type of panels, and really the approach of one side is we tell you what you need to do and how to do it. There is one more area that is actually getting your team to cooperate. And I think that he did a brilliant work on his practice, innovating all the time, keep adding new things, new ways, keep improving, pushing that ceiling up. And he's one of the greatest pioneer of our industry, right? One of only 2 people ever in the industry ever been president of the International and the American Society president.
Sure. So he brings the voice of the practical application of the services to the practice, right? We've talked about this before, where, it's not just the aesthetic industry, right? You can go to a weekend retreat or a one-day seminar, and if there's not really something that helps ground the information, it's just information, right? By the time you get home, you're super inspired, but who knows how much of it you actually apply, right?
Correct. And that's really the biggest differentiator, right? They leave the aesthetic success meeting. They normally leave on Sunday. By Monday, they actually practically know. We practice it with them, hands-on, how to analyze their P&L. They're coming with their P&L. We analyze it together. We're writing for them their business process. They building their credentials over there. They're practicing. They do role plays, right? They go back on Monday, and a lot of them coming with a lot of staff into the meeting. So they don't need to be the one that trained them later. They just leave there all on the same page and start to execute brand new type of business on Monday.
Yeah, that's great.
And it works like magic. We have like amazing feedback. And that's really what we're to keep doing.
I believe that you're sort of on the bleeding edge of a trend. We've talked about this before too, that the larger meetings are shifting to people are attending more of the smaller meetings and going to the smaller meetings with the intention of walking out of there with practical information that they can apply to the practice. We've talked about, you touched on leads a little bit, right? And we talked about this before too. The idea that when I first started in this industry, it was lead generation. How many leads can you generate for my practice, right? And then a handful of years ago, it became about speed to lead, right? 5 minutes, lead is dead. And if you're not responding to that lead, and then we moved into lead exhaustion, which is kind of the space we've been in lately. It's like, hey, now that you have a lead, make sure you're retargeting them, make sure you're sending them emails, make sure you're following up. But we're just now starting to encroach on, hey, the person answering your phone in the office needs a sales skill set or some sales training, and you've spent sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars on marketing, and you're not treating the person who's answering the phone like a salesperson, and it's a massive lost opportunity, right?
That is exactly correct. And actually, in a lot of my lectures, I always ask the question of like, what is more important, making a dollar or saving a dollar?
Yeah.
And the real answer is, unless you're making a dollar, you have nothing to save, right? So first, focus on how to make it, and it really starts with your phone desk. It's your
Yeah.
first line. It's a first impression. It's how they answer the phone, how they greet the people that coming in, how they smile. Whether it's on the phone or in person, you always see smiles. So
Sure.
I think you're 100% on it. It's so
So
overlooked position and so underpaid sometimes,
yeah.
and such a high turnaround. And so if you don't have a solid training and you don't treat them the right way, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think I told you, I sent you an article yesterday, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I was recently given the opportunity to write for Forbes. And the very first article I wrote was on this subject of sort of leads coming into the practice and then not being handled appropriately. And that I'm so glad that that era is ending, because, you know, the old days of marketing agency was we could lead them to water, but we can't make them drink. And now we're saying, hey, get the consulting, make them drink. So
Correct.
I think it's
Well,
great.
soon it's going to be bringing them to the aesthetic success, and then
Yeah, excited about that. So the format for this show is 3 questions where we dive into the most important things that you talk about on stage. You're one of the thought leaders in the industry, so I really appreciate you being on this episode. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. You know, we're going to try to leave the listeners over the next 15, 20 minutes with stuff they can take home and apply directly to their practice. So let's dive in. So you and I have talked about these things. These are things that you talk about on stage. They're not surprise questions. We're really trying to leave people with usable content. So
yeah, absolutely.
The first question, when it comes to owning and operating a successful aesthetic practice, what is the most important KPI to measure?
Yeah, and I think that I wish there was a very simple answer to give to people, but I'll give it in a way that's going to help them to at least know where to start. And I think it's all start with where are they in the life cycle of a practice. Let's try to break it into 3 phases of a practice. Let's call it the 1 to 3 years. It's really the growth. It's really where you focus on what can help you stay in business. Most businesses that's the time of survival, right? So anything that really analyze where the money come from and who is my client's advice. So anything related to the lead source, where the leads coming from, what lead sources works, what people buy, what generate the most amount of revenue, which machines, what providers. Those are the areas that really needs to take, I'll say 90% of the focus of the practice needs to be on growth and revenue. Crossing that phase, they're going to move into what I call the ROI phase, which is normally between the 2nd to the 3rd year, all the way to like 5-6 years in business. Now they need to cash out on all those investments, right? They build a brand, they put the billboard, they now have marketing company, they already have a lot of posts on social media, they have reviews, they have all of those things, they understand what works, now how to optimize it. And that's really, I'll say, where they need to start to look into the financials, right? And the profitability of things. Profit per treatments, capacities of the room, capacities of the providers, how many hours do they work, how many hours actually in the room servicing clients. And then the 3rd phase is really expansion. That's really they need to consider another location, more machines, more staff, more services, right? That's really where they need to start to think about potential
Scaling.
growth and multipliers even on their patients. Mm-hmm. At the very core of it, I'll say, if nothing else, all practices should at least look at the revenue driver. And the revenue driver builds from very simple 2 elements. How many patients do you see? How much each patient spends on average? That's revenue driver for any business, any type of business, no matter which one. So if nothing else, at least have that understanding and see that that makes sense for how many hours do you work and what do you expect to make. Because if those numbers not going to add up, you're never going to make what you expect.
Sure. How much is the product? What are the costs of goods sold? Right. So I have a question for you. You talked about sort of as a practice, as an aesthetic practice, or even the specialty medical practices. Some of our listeners are oral surgeons as well. How do they know? You described running before you, or walking before you run, right? So how do you know what is the key indicator that you've achieved enough in the walking phase before you can run? Everybody wants to start a practice and be in the expansion or the growth or the scaling phase. How do you know when it's time to scale without breaking it?
I'll say to me, the number one indicator, and it's not just to me, it's really, there is companies that live and die by those numbers. There is something called NPS score, and I actually speaks about it a lot when I lecturing and ask, who knows what NPS stands for? And 90% of the time, nobody knows. And it stands for Net Promoter Score, and it's actually something all of us interact with all the time because large corporation, like I said, they live and die by that. It's that question of like, would you recommend this business to your friends and family?
Sure.
And that has only one correct answer. It's normally a meter, 1 to 10, or 1 to 3, or 1 to 5, or it's yes or no, right? And there is only one good answer, 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anything else means that you have room to improve, because or else people are not going to send you their friends or their family. And until you really conquer that and that's solid, and you start to see referrals coming from your existing patients into your door, you did not pass the proof of concept as far as I'm concerned. Because if you still pay the highest cost of acquisition for a transaction, which means every patient come and he only come one time and he doesn't bring his friends and he's not as a recurring and all of those things does not work well, that numbers of referrals as a percentage of your clients is your main indicator to know, am I doing good business? Do my customers are happy or not? And if your customers are not happy, you have things you need to improve in your business. So I think that is the number one by the main indicator. And if that number grows and grows, you'll do very well, and you can move through those phases super quick.
Sure. I think I don't know if I've had this conversation with you before, but a phenomenon that we sort of picked up on when we started working in the oral surgery space, right? The aesthetic industry has been hyper focused on digital marketing for a very long time, and sometimes to a fault, where they don't focus on traditional marketing or community-based events and things like that to create brand recognition. Where in the oral surgery space, prior to them starting to get competitive for placing dental implants and full mouth restoration, they relied heavily on general dentists referring to their practice. So they really nurtured those leads. They did a lot of stuff in the community to really nurture that stuff. And when we started working in the oral surgery space, what I noticed is that the branded search, so the amount of people visiting their website based on the name of their practice, was much higher than an aesthetic practice. And after doing some beta testing and launching some traditional marketing products that we're now using in the aesthetic space and the oral surgery space, we're seeing that it's that key component, like having referrals, have brand awareness, have people just in general in the community knowing who you are. I think that's largely overlooked in the aesthetic space.
No, 100%. I think sometimes people don't realize that they look into those big brands, right? Like the Ideal Image of the world and those big chains that can really service anybody in the state, whatever place they're in. But to the vast majority, even that 1 location, 2 location, 3 location, those are local businesses, service in person, very personalized relationship built there. I'll say to some degree, right? So the component of the referrals being involved in your community, you have a zone, you have a radius of where your people are going to come to you. And normally people are not going to fly. There is very few practices in the US people fly special for them, and they rely on the business model on people going to fly in and stuff. To the vast majority, 95% of the businesses exist from their surrounding, from the local people around them. So it's really to understand who are the people around you, right? And that you should actually do before you open the practice. But once you're already in business, make sure you create a relationship with everything to do with the people in your area, all the communities, whether it's parties, donations, stuff like that, sponsorships. It's a
good
key
old-fashioned networking.
Old-fashioned, and that brings the referrals. Once you start to see that referral needle moves, everything becomes easy. People buy more, they buy more easy, they send their friends. It's a very interesting concept of referrals, because once you refer your friend, not only you refer your friend, 90% chance he's already going to buy something, and for more expensive and it's going to be a quicker conversion, you instantly becoming more loyal. Because if I send my friend, and imagine then me starting to go somewhere else, that is not cool, right? So that's kind of like how referral works. It's a two sides wins. So that is the key, I'll say, for all.
So it sounds to me like one of the most important key performance indicators before moving forward would be having a good beat on your referral base and making sure that that's solid.
That's exactly correct. Try to get your referrals percentage on where do you get your new customers to above 25% coming from referrals.
Sure.
You're there, you're going to be potentially even recession proof to some degree.
Perfect. All right. Question number 2. What is the most important thing to consider when looking at the financials for an aesthetic practice?
I think that the number one mistake that I see in a lot of practices that analyze their financials, they take all the revenue and put it as a one line revenue. Sometimes you see 2 lines, revenue and injectables or some other significant one. And there is no correlation to the COGS. Many times the COGS is totally wrong or doesn't capture things that it should capture. So you can really understand your gross profit. And so I'll say the first is to break down the revenue by categories. Correlate those categories with your COGS. So you can really see back on the envelope or just by looking at your P&L, you can see how much revenue you generate from injectables, what was the COGS. How much you generated from laser skin tightening, what was the COGS. Just by looking at that, you're going to realize that injectables doesn't really make money, and laser skin tightening leave you about 90% to continue to play with, right, of profitability.
Right.
Including the labor cost that approved by the IRS to include as part of the COGS is a key also to understand your profitability, because you cannot generate that revenue unless your provider is in the room. If he's in the room, you pay for that time. That has to be deducted from the revenue that he's generating, right? Because that's starting to clean up what is your profitability that then needs to share with all your other operating expenses. It doesn't mean that you stop to do one thing necessarily and start to do only one other thing, but it's how to combine them is truly the magic. We teach the methodology of building treatment plan with the concept of no patient should ever leave the practice unless they have a treatment plan in their hand. The treatment plan is really the way for you as a practice owner, not only to secure the long term of that patient in your practice, but also the profitability you're going to get from that patient. One of the mistakes that I see also very common is people are advertising or spending a lot of money on advertising injectables. Why? Because everybody's searching injectables. So it's kind of like I'm giving them what they're looking for. And then they're also giving a special. And then they also pay commission. And they're already not making injectable money. So really from the first transaction of that patient, they lost money. And if they don't charge for consult, they lost multipliers, right? But even if they do, they're not going to make money just from the first appointment of injectable if it came from a marketing source. Period. So unless they convert that patient into additional services, and it can even be retail, right? Retail is 100% markup. If you can even convert them to something simple as that, then you start to get in the clear. Then it starts to make a lot more sense for you to do business. So I think when it comes to the financials, it's really understand the profitability and everything in your service books or on your menu. Anything that you offer, you need to know back on your top of your mind what is make more sense than others. It doesn't mean that you're going to give people something that they don't need, but you're going to build it in a way that it's a win-win for both sides.
Sure. I also heard you say some variation of be very clear on what the cost of goods sold is, right? They don't overlook the amount of time you have to pay someone to be in the room for the consults or any of those things. That's all part of it. And I think that largely gets overlooked. Is that accurate?
That's exactly correct. All of those goes as part of the costs, right? Somebody's in the room, that costs you money as a business because it's time that you could have generated different revenue, or you could not generate that revenue without them being in that room. So whatever you pay them needs to go as part of the costs, the labor cost, and that shows you where you fall. And your gross profit has to be above 50%. If you're below that, you might gonna have a problem to overcome your operating expenses. And just for ballpark for our audiences, and that's primarily for, I guess, the aesthetic side, when you look at your EBITDA, so after all those operating expenses, if you're a med spa and you landed below the 20 or 25%, you really need help. I'll say more than anything, you need to restructure some things. There's some stuff that you do wrong. And I'll say the number one thing that we've seen med spas do wrong is paying too much. Compensation is wrong. They pay too much, mainly for the injectables, right? Or injectors, because they come with the portfolio, whatever excuse it is, right? But if they don't mix the services, then that's where their profitability drops and they're operating in a loss, or they're going to be on a very thin line and not making enough money to make sense to run a business. If you're plastic surgery, you rarely have any of those issues. Your profitability is so high that your EBITDA is going to be 80, 90% easily. And it's really now it starts to depend on how many support team do you want to have, how many you really need to have, and then how much money you spend on marketing and acquisition, stuff like that. That's really where the majority is going to go to.
Sure, sure. All right. So, question number 3. Where do you see most practices fail when they're trying to maximize performance?
I think in training, I think that most of where we see, I mentioned compensation before, it's probably the number one, but I think it's also all has to do tied up with compensation, culture, team meetings, having the entire practice working as one unit, having that workflow laid down so everybody understands what is their role in the practice, how can they do it the most efficient. So being accountable to their position and their role inside that experience or the patient journey or the workflow of the business, anyone, it's all the same things at the end. But what is that they do and how do they hold accountable for it, right? So let's say a team meeting in the ideal world, the team meeting, what I seen today, most practices do, all the team comes into the room, the doctor gives food for free for everybody normally, and he just speak about things that he wants to do or beat up somebody who didn't do something right or take some example of something that happened recently, and that everybody get bored and everybody go back to do exactly the same thing that they did before. In the ideal world, the really way that it needs to work, the owner needs to come, needs to sit and barely say anything. The team with their own different roles, owning their KPIs or the OKRs or whatever it is, represents whether they do or do not do a good job, and represent where they are against their goals, what they expected from them. So they know at all time if they do a good job or bad job, and they report it in front of everybody else. And that's bring up, if they miss it, that's really where the opportunity of the owners to say why, and not why from beating them up, why on how can I help to support you to reach that goal, or is this goal maybe unrealistic, right? And that's really where I think that that's the missed piece of almost all practices. They don't run properly as a team. And so they're all going to tell you, oh, but when we were small, it worked so amazing, because it's hands-on, everything is easy.
Sure.
When you start to grow, that's really where the challenge is. Inefficiencies, other people see inefficiencies, it leads to more inefficiencies, and then you start to buy on kind of different tools that never being used, and then frustration starts, and the story is very well known from there on, right? And that's what we see the vast majority. So where they can optimize, I'll say focus on your team, focus on the training, focus on lay down the process so everybody have what is expected for them to do, and they need to know whether they do a good job or not.
Sure. Just because we started this conversation with data, how do you, in your mind, wrap data into where you focus?
Goals.
Cool.
Once you lay down your process, then you can start to define. The phone rings. How quickly do you want them to answer? After 2 rings, right? Or after 5 seconds, whatever it is that you set. But that is a KPI already right there. Now, as long as that KPI is in the green, which means they do it, there is no problem, right? You move to the next step. After they answer the phone, did they credential themselves? Did they credential the practice? If yes, good. No, okay, you should have an area to improve. Then it's existing or not existing, right? So you really lay down as a business owner, and that's a DNA later that follows you and later allows you, actually, once you crack that recipe or the format, that makes a difference between the 1 or 2 locations to the 20, 30, 40, 50 locations.
Sure.
It's a replicate of a working recipe. It's a playbook.
Which is not a new concept.
No, not at all. That's right. How all the big ones do it. Yes, 100%.
Some practices are 3, 4, 6 people, and so they see themselves as a very small business, so they don't see the need for that structure, organization, and training. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very right. There is 4 and 6 people practice that generate so much, and they're so busy, and they barely get to interact between each other. At that point, they have to have goals. They have to have the process. If they are close enough and they do interact a lot, and it's kind of like on the fly, constantly everybody know what they do, or everybody is taken care of, and to the point, the referral needle is moving up, right? And business is doing well, and the profitability where it needs to be, then don't add another burden. If it works, it works. But if you're thinking about expansion, or you're thinking about growth, or you're thinking about how will I train the next employee to answer exactly the same way that the employee is already there, and you don't want to play that broken phone of whatever I remember to teach him today, and tomorrow I remember to teach him something else, then that's really where it becomes critical for success.
Sure.
That's where it normally gets off. With the front desk coming in, the previous person trained them, but the previous person was trained by somebody who was there only for 2 months, right? And
Sure.
it's always like that. And then between what the doctor remembered that they used to answer and convert anybody that called to an appointment, it's now at 20-30% of the phone calls are being consults.
Yeah. That you mentioned playbooks earlier, which I think is a concept from Traction or Get a Grip. I don't know if you've read either of those books, but
No, I
that is a
actually did
big
not.
part of.
I,
That's a big part of
yeah.
firm media, though, is playbooks, right? Before I had playbooks, the system would break all the time, and now everything here has a playbook. So
Right. And the concept of playbook is really to come to the way that I use playbook is to prevent the need of reinvent the wheel every time, every question, even if it's the same question 100 times. If you have the playbook, it's done. You do it once and you go. And then you just learn based on data how to improve that playbook, but you don't need to reinvent the processes and the procedure and the rules every time. So that is really the playbook.
sure. Isaac, all of this was super fascinating. I really appreciate you being on this episode and sharing your insight with everybody. I have one more question for you. This is the part of the show where we ask for your Ailm Essential Insight, which is just one takeaway, a usable takeaway that somebody can apply directly to their practice right when they stop listening to the show.
My biggest advice that I'll give to any business owner, be obsessive regarding satisfaction. Satisfaction to your customer, your patients, and satisfaction to your employees and the people who works with you. If somebody is not happy, don't keep them, not as a customer, and if it's not your fault. If you did everything you can, it's sometimes just not going to work out, right? But
Sure.
in 99% of the time, you can make all your employees happy and all your customers happy, and then life becoming so easy as a business owner. And that's
Sure.
really where you see those business owners that they're burned out, they struggle, they hate the drama, they hate to wake up Monday morning, right? Because they know that everybody's going to come to them. It's because people are not happy, or the business they do doesn't make happy customers. And so
Sure.
if they're going to be obsessive about it and all the time think, how can I make people happier? And it's not a compensation. And it's already been proven so many times that it's not about how much people make, it's really about being appreciated. And so if
Sure.
they appreciate it to the people who work around them, if somebody doesn't do a good job, find somebody else, right? It's not a bad word to say in business. That's how business works. So
Sure.
I'll say be obsessive regarding satisfaction. That is the biggest takeaway. Everything going to work out well for you.
Such great insight. As I started the show with, you're a thought leader in the industry. I really appreciate you taking the time to share this stuff. I hope that the listeners get as much out of it as I did. There's some good takeaways for me to apply to business as well. I'm looking forward to watching the 4S Summit. Is it 4S Summit? Is that the way it's being referred to?
Yeah, 4S Summit is how they're going to find it. The Aesthetic Success running the 4S Summit.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to watching that unfold, and I'm looking forward to participating in that. Really appreciate you being on the show. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.